Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about religious epistemology. This is something that we talked about in one of our apologetics meetings back at The Ohio State University in spring of last year. Now, let me go ahead and offer some suggested readings. There is no way we will get through the entire topic of religious epistemology or anything about epistemology within one presentation. So go ahead and check some of these books out. We have How Do We Know? An Introduction to Epistemology by James Dew and Mark Foreman. We have Jay Wood's book called Epistemology Becoming Intellectually Virtuous. J.P. Moreland's book, Kingdom Triangle, is a good one. And then What Can We Know? An Introduction to the Theory of Knowledge. So these are just some books to get you started if you want to go deeper on the topic. Now, it comes to epistemology. This is a branch of philosophy. Everybody does philosophy on some level on a daily basis. So sometimes Christians or other religious people say, well, you know, philosophy is all pagan and we don't need it. Well, just remember that most of these branches here of philosophy are related to things that you partake of on a daily basis. For example, metaphysics or ontology is a study of existence or reality. Epistemology, which we're talking about here, is a study of knowledge, the true nature of knowledge and belief. Ethics talks about what we should do. Aesthetics investigates the nature of such things as beauty and art. And of course, we have political philosophy, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind. There's some other fields as well, but these are just overall some of the branches of philosophy. So everybody's faith is related to these things at some level. No, it's true you don't have to have a degree in philosophy. However, I think it's important to understand that everybody does do some philosophy on a daily basis. So there is a relationship between philosophy and faith. C.S. Lewis said here, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. So what exactly is epistemology? That is the branch of philosophy where we study knowledge. What exactly is knowledge? How is knowledge acquired? How do we know what we know? Why do we know what we know? So epistemology is something that we partake of on a daily basis. It deals with types of certainty or types of doubt, tests for truth. And let me just go ahead and mention some practical ways you deal with epistemology on a daily basis. For example, there's what's called know-how knowledge, and this is the ability to do certain things for certain purposes. Of course, many people are in school getting a degree, or they're on a job site or learning a new skill in a job to make a living. That's called know-how knowledge. There's also what's called propositional knowledge. This is knowledge where you state a proposition is true, such as I know God exists, or I am going to the grocery store, or I am going to marry Susie or Jenny, or Mark says he's going to marry Linda. These are all statements you make. They're propositional knowledge. There's something called experiential knowledge or testimonial knowledge. Of course, we rely on that on a daily basis. If I say I know Jeremiah and Jeremiah knows Eric, and one of us says he's the coolest person on the face of the earth, that is testimonial knowledge. Obviously, we rely on the testimony of others on a daily basis. Of course, number 4, we rely on authorities to attain knowledge. We can't learn everything. We can't master every field. That's why many of us go to college and we listen to authorities teach us on certain topics. We listen to the news. We read books by others who are authorities on specific topics. And of course, we rely on our 5 senses and memory for knowledge on a daily basis as well. So epistemology is very practical. We do use it on a daily basis. Most people just don't know that, but it is something that is very important. Epistemology also has to do with justification. Justification is a belief that is said to be justified when it is based on good reason or reasons, or has the right grounds or foundation. For example, you might ask, what kind of justification do you have that Jesus rose from the dead? An atheist would say that Christians are not justified in saying Jesus rose from the dead. A Christian theist may say an atheist has no justification for their atheism. Of course, this goes round and round with people of different religions as well. A Muslim would say a Christian is not justified in believing Jesus died because the Quran says he didn't die, and a Christian would say a Muslim is not justified in saying Jesus didn't die because the Quran is written 650 years after the Bible. Now, a definition of knowledge is given here by J.P. Moreland. He says he defines knowledge as it is to represent reality in thought or experience the way it really is on the basis of adequate grounds. To know something, the nature of cancer, or forgiveness, or God, is to think of or experience it as it really is on a solid basis of evidence, experience, intuition, and so forth. Little can be said in general about what counts as adequate grounds. That's another topic, exactly what can count as adequate grounds. A little bit about knowledge and certainty here. Some people, obviously when it comes to religious epistemology and God's existence, they obviously get caught up with the issue of what kinds of certainty we can have. This leads to all kinds of skepticism and doubt. And of course, everybody struggles with doubt. Doubt's just part of life. But, let's give a little example here. Remember, you can know something without being absolutely certain about it or highly certain about it in the presence of doubt or the admission that one might be wrong. Let me give an example here. If you decide to get married, you may tell somebody, I know my fiance is the right choice. Of course, you do not have absolute certainty or high certainty that the spouse may not be faithful to you, may get sick, lose a job, you may have relational problems. The list goes on. The point is that you may have all kinds of uncertainties and still say, I know my fiance is the right choice. Of course, you may say, I know this job is the right one for me. You may say, I know this job is the right one for me, but you have all kinds of issues of uncertainty. You may say, I know this president is the right choice for our country, but you may still have some uncertainty about him or her. You may say, I know this is the right place to live, but you may have some uncertainty about the neighborhood, the future, of course. You may have some things that come up later on. So the point is that you say, I can know something with certain issues of uncertainty. That's just the way life is. So you can have some doubt, but still know and say you're making the right choice. One thing that has happened is there's some confusion about whether Christianity is a faith tradition or knowledge tradition. Obviously, most people think Christianity is a faith tradition because many Bible teachers and pastors and ministry leaders and seminaries have not done a great job of incorporating the relationship between faith and knowledge, or what we say integrating the relationship to faith and knowledge. We need to remember, of course, as J.P. Moreland talks about, that the Bible talks a lot about knowledge. For example, in Hosea 4:6, God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Notice he doesn't say they're destroyed for lack of faith. He says because they've rejected knowledge, he'll reject them from being his priest. And so, remember, the Bible talks a lot about knowledge. Sometimes we get these confused, and of course the culture is incredibly confused because of social media and the lack of teaching on this issue in the churches. Remember, of course, that knowledge can be the thing as to what keeps you close to God over the long haul. Sometimes we rely on our emotions alone, and if we have no knowledge, this leads to all kinds of problems because your emotions can come and go, your feelings can be fickle, your emotions can be up and down. And so sometimes we need to rely on knowledge, and we need to say, I know what God says about me, or I know the promises of God. I stand on what the Bible says about me because the Bible is giving me knowledge. And we need to remember, of course, that knowledge and faith go hand in hand. Of course, there is some problems in the relationship, and we see the divorce from faith and knowledge in our culture. This is talked about in the book Total Truth by Nancy Pearcey. She's written a lot about this and others as well. We have what's called the faith or the fact-value dichotomy, because in the Enlightenment, where we see everything coming into dualisms, we have a lot of dualisms in our culture now where two things are apparently opposed to one another. And so people think facts and values are separate. Facts are what are solid and provable, objective, and values are matters of personal taste and subjective. And so obviously this is the problem we have today because people think religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs are all subjective. They're not solid and provable. They're not objective at all. And then, of course, science is the only thing that gives us things that are objectable facts or objective facts. And so this is a problem we have in our culture, and it carries on in academia. We have what's called the fact-value dichotomy. And remember, when it comes to studying the word faith in the Bible, of course, we haven't done a great job of explaining that. For example, here in John 3:16, where it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." One of the most quoted passages in the history of Christian thought. We have the word pisteuo here, and if you look that up, obviously in a Greek lexicon, it talks about, it means to consider something to be true and therefore to be worthy of one's trust, to entrust oneself to an entity, complete confidence. So it does have an issue of trust and confidence. Sometimes Christians say that they want to drop the word faith and just supplement the word trust. I have no problem with that because the word faith is so butchered and misunderstood in our culture. And then we come to the Hebrews 11:1 passage where most people quote it out of context, even atheists quote it out of context. And they say faith is the substance of things hoped for the evidence of things not seen. The Greek word pistis is the word for faith. And once again, that has to do with a state of believing on the basis of reliability of the one trusted. It means trust, confidence, reliability, fidelity. And actually, faith and faithfulness are not divorced from each other in the Bible. So let's make sure we're looking up and studying the word faith very carefully, the way it's used in various contexts in the Bible. We don't want to read it out of context because this passage alone is why many people think faith is blind and unsupported by evidence, because they read it out of context. So you certainly have a problem with the word faith and how that is being defined in our culture today. Now let's talk a little bit about agnosticism. Agnosticism comes from the two Greek words, gnosis and knowledge. No gnosis or knowledge. It literally means no knowledge, the opposite of Gnostic. Thus, an agnostic is someone who claims not to know. There are two basic kinds of agnostics, those who claim that the existence and nature of God are not known, and those who hold God to be unknowable. There are three basic alternatives with respect to knowledge about God. Number one, we can know nothing about God. He's simply unknowable. Number two, we can know everything about God. He can be exhaustively known. And number three, we can know something but not everything about God. God is partially knowable. I would probably go with number three here. I think that is the biblical view. Obviously, we can know some things about God, but he's not exhaustively known. And number one would be false as well, because God is not unknowable. So let's look at atheism here in contrast to agnosticism. Technically, atheism is just a lack of belief in a certain deity. Of course, atheism is defined differently by different atheists. Sometimes people say atheism is simply a lack of belief in gods. Third, the word atheism comes from the negative, of which means no, and theos, which means God. Hence, atheism in the most basic term means no God. Some atheists think they escape the burden of proof, of course, by claiming they lack belief rather than have a belief there is no God. So if you ever talk to them, they'll just say to you, well, I lack a belief, and now the burden of proof's on you to show me there's a God. And of course, that goes round and round. And so we need to make sure we get our definitions correct. Strong and weak atheism. Strong atheists actively believe and state that no God exists. They express and denounce the biblical God along with any other God. Of course, they are very active and aggressive and openly believe there's no God. People like this are generally evangelists for atheism, such as Richard Dawkins and others. Then there's weak atheists. A weak atheist might be better explained as a person who lacks a belief in God, the way a person might lack a belief that there's a green lizard in a rocking chair. They may not be aggressive as strong atheists and not as evangelistic. Just depends who you talk to. In many cases, you run into circular reasoning with atheists because in many cases, they'll try to put the burden of proof on religious people or Christians or people who believe the Bible, and they'll ask for evidence, and then you come up with evidence, and they say that isn't evidence, and they try to define what evidence is, and then, of course, you never can reach the bar that they set, and it just goes around in a circle because they are the ones who define the rules, and you have to play by their rules. So unfortunately, this leads to atheist circular reasoning. Now, some equate knowledge with being able to arrive at virtual certainty. I talked a little bit about this previously, but let's look at some of the points here. When you talk about virtual certainty, that's where the evidence is overwhelmingly in its favor, such as the law of gravity. There's what's called high probability. There's very good evidence in its favor. There's what's called probable. It means there's sufficient evidence in its favor. There's possible, which means there seems to be evidence both for and against it. Or improbable means there's insufficient evidence in its favor. There's highly improbable, meaning very little evidence in its favor. And then there's virtually impossible, which means almost no evidence in its favor. Many people assume they must have virtual certainty to know there is a God. When it comes to history, of course, that's inductive, so that's based on probability levels. You're not going to get virtual certainty in anything in history, and many sciences as well, because science is a study of things that, in many cases, we weren't there to observe directly. And so just remember, some people fall on this scale here, and it depends on what their view is of what evidence is, and this gets into probability levels and issues of induction and deduction and abduction. Now, Mortimer Adler here, he was a former, he was a person who didn't believe in God. He became a Christian later on in life. I would say his definition of certitude comes into the play here because many people act like they need to have certitude for God's existence. Belief is said to reach certitude when a judgment is subject to doubt if there's any possibility of all of its being challenged in the light of additional or more acute observations, or of its being criticized on the basis of more cogent or more comprehensive reasoning. And then when you run into judgments that are indubitable or beyond doubt, beyond such criticism or challenges, that means you reach certitude. I think most of us know that we don't reach certitude in practically anything in life unless it's mathematical issues like 2 + 2 = 4. But many people act like they need to have certitude before they make a decision to think there's a God or follow Jesus or have any kind of commitment to theism at all. Now, as far as skepticism, there is what's called common sense skepticism. I believe there is a need for healthy skepticism that can suspend judgment one time or another. Obviously, many Christians are skeptical of all other religious beliefs, such as Mormonism, Islam. Of course, atheism is skeptical. Most atheists are skeptical of all religious beliefs. So there is a need for common sense skepticism. That's part of the way you form beliefs. That's okay. But then we run into what's called hyperskepticism, where many say, I will not commit to God or the belief in Jesus or Christian theism or biblical theism until I attain exhaustive knowledge or I get almost all my questions answered and I attain certitude, as I said before. So many people fall into the level of hyperskepticism. They won't admit it. But at the end of the day, most of us make decisions based on probability levels. And we just need to find some sort of middle ground here between a common sense skepticism and a healthy skepticism. So just depends on who you talk to and where they're at. Now it comes to approaching the God question. When people try to find knowledge of God, some people utilize religious experience. They have mystical experiences with God. They think that knowledge of God is attainable through direct religious experience. Some people believe pragmatism is a way to find knowledge of God that comes through practical benefit. Some people stress rationalism, which stresses the mind. Some people utilize empiricism, which stresses the 5 senses. And of course, many people use scienticism, or they think because they think science is the only way to gather knowledge. It's the most reliable way to gather knowledge. There's some other methods. I just want to mention these as we go forward here. When it comes to mysticism, religious experience, there's no doubt that people have religious experiences. Of course, Christians say they have the Holy Spirit, which gives them direct knowledge of God. It's not inferred from anything else. It is intuitive. It is a direct encounter on a daily basis. We know that many people have contradictory religious experiences. There's other people from other faiths that claim to experience their God. Now, remember, the fact that there are contradictory religious experiences doesn't automatically mean they're all invalid or false. It's possible that people of any religion may experience God in terms of having a sense of the divine. And we do know the validity of personal religious experience does not negate the need to have other good reasons for faith. So we shouldn't be against religious experience, but religious experience is not the only reason to claim you have knowledge of God. That would not go far in this culture. You need to have other good reasons for saying you have knowledge that there is a God or that Jesus is the Son of God. Then, of course, we have pragmatism. which comes through practical benefit. Knowledge of God comes through practical benefit. Some people say, I tried Jesus, he worked in my life, I see a difference. Of course, they see the practical benefit of believing in such a thing. They see the outworking of it in their lives. This is obviously a very, very common view. Obviously, you run into some problems because some people say they try Islam or Buddhism and it makes a difference in their lives. And of course, the questions become, what kind of difference did it make? Does it have to do with morality, character, inspiration to do good works? And of course, fourth here, the validity of practical benefit does not negate the need to have other good reasons or evidence for faith. So even if you see a positive pragmatic outcome in your belief system, that doesn't negate the need to have other good reasons for what you believe. Because obviously, if someone says Islam or Buddhism works for them, and Christian says Christianity works for them, you're going to have a three-way tie about who actually has knowledge of God. So you need some other reasons for why you think you have knowledge of God than pragmatic benefit. Then we have rationalism. Rationalism, typically they distrust their senses and believe gaining knowledge is a matter of logically deducing true propositions from absolutely certain starting axioms. So this is what we call a priori knowledge. It's not based on experience. It's not inductive. This is something that obviously that Descartes had when you study his thought and how he influenced philosophy. There are obviously rationalists out there today. Obviously, skeptics tend to say that atheism or skepticism is built on reason, while religion is blind faith. Being rational is about acquiring true beliefs. There's nothing wrong with that. We're trying to acquire true beliefs, but they say since theism has no evidence, it's irrational. Many times, skeptics tend to confuse rationalism with empiricism. They misunderstand the limits of science. That happens all the time. And so let's go ahead and define naturalism here. Naturalism is defined as a naturalist is someone who does not affirm the supernatural. They reject the existence of God, ghosts, or immaterial souls and spirits. They affirm the natural realm only. They believe nature is all there is. Number 3, they put stock in empirical, evidence-based ways of justifying opinions about what is real. That is exemplified by science. They reject various kinds of revelation, sacred texts, religious authority, reports by people claiming to have religious experiences. So I bring this up because we're dealing with the issue of rationalism here and rationality, and I just want to mention this issue of how and why whether naturalism can ground human rationality. Kenneth Sample says something there in his book, The World of Difference. It's kind of interesting. He says, according to the naturalistic worldview, the source or foundation of man's reasoning was not itself rational, endowed with reason, nor was it personal, self-aware, intelligent, and it was definitely not teleological. It has no purpose in nature. Rather, it was a non-rational and impersonal process without purpose, consisting of a combination of genetic mutation, a variation of environmental factors such as natural selection. Naturalism postulates that a combination of random chance and blind impersonal natural processes, physical and chemical in nature, produce humanity's rational faculties. Of course, this leads to issues whether naturalism has a good foundation for rationality. And this is talked about in greater length in C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea that's talked about by Victor Riepert here. He wrote a book called C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea. The Magician's Twins, another book that talks about this. And so Lewis talked a lot about Darwin's doubt, about reasoning, where Darwin said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or trustworthy. Would one trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? And so in Lewis, when you look at Lewis and the argument from reason, he talks about this, which Riepert talks about in greater length in his book. He talks about how all possible knowledge depends on the validity of reasoning. Of course, you have deductive and inductive arguments, and that forms our basis for reasoning. And so there is no reasoning apart from the ability to assess deductive and inductive arguments, abductive arguments as well. And the question becomes, if matter is all there is, whether naturalism, materialism can even provide such things such as propositions, perceptions, and logical relations. Of course, in naturalism, materialism doesn't contain such things, such as an immaterial mind, propositions, perceptions, and logical relations. And this is talked a little bit more in the book about, this issue is talked about a little more in the book by Nagel here called Mind and Cosmos. He's not a believer, he's an atheist, but he says that a materialist approach to life and mind has failed to explain consciousness, intentionality, and purpose and meaning and value. And to have rationality, you must have intentionality. And because naturalism can't ground intentionality, nor physicalism can ground intentionality, that leads to problems of how naturalism or materialism could ground rational thought. This is talked about in greater length, of course, in Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Science, Religion, Naturalism. He has done a lot of work in talking about what's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. I'm not going to go into it in great detail here. Of course, there's been counter-arguments against it, and Plantinga has responded. You'd have to read all the literature, which I'll talk about in a minute. But he says here, if evolution is driven by natural selection, as Darwin's theory dictates, and evolution doesn't care a whit about what an organism believes, it only cares about how an organism behaves. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't matter whether an organism has true beliefs, false beliefs, or no beliefs at all, as long as the organism can effectively preserve and pass on its genes. So evolution isn't truth-directed, it's only survival-directed. And as Patricia Churchland says here, boiled down to its essentials, the nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal core of nervous systems is to get the body parts they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensory control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing is advantageous so long as it's geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival. Truth, whatever it is, definitely takes the hindmost. And so basically what she's saying is that in evolution, truth is not the ultimate goal. It's just survival. And this is talked about in greater length in Plantinga's work. Of course, there was a book that was written that dealt with Plantinga's views here called Naturalism Defeated. And then Plantinga has updated his version of the argument in the book called The Nature of Nature, examining the role of naturalism in science. You can read about it in there. So there's certainly an ongoing debate about this issue. I can't go over everything about it in this presentation, but it is an interesting discussion. Remember, there's a difference a little bit between Plantinga's argument and Lewis's argument against the argument from reason. So make sure you read both of those and study both sides there. Now it comes to empiricism. It stresses the 5 senses, and many people think unless they can use their 5 senses to empirically verify God's existence, God must not exist. You can't have knowledge of God, and therefore the case is closed. There's no God. So in response to that, we need to ask, what do you mean by God? Of course, in the biblical God, the traditional view, we believe in a personal creator who's worthy of worship, has moral perfection, has an all-loving character. And of course, in the Bible, biblically speaking, no man can see God directly and live. We read about that in Exodus 33:20. So God is therefore inaccessible to mortal man on a face-by-face basis. Nobody can see God in a full visual representation. Obviously, people did experience God and see certain aspects of God in theophanies in the Old Testament, but nobody can see God directly firsthand. So we need to remember in this issue that the nature of the object determines how we will know it and whether it corresponds to reality. For example, if we say that God, the Bible exists, we need to ask whether God is a physical object that can be verified directly with our 5 senses. And obviously, God in the Bible, the biblical God, is not a physical object. We'd only know that unless God shows us what he's like, and we believe he's done that in the world of nature and the world of history. So remember, the nature of the object determines how you know it and what you can, or how you gather knowledge about that object. And so the question becomes, if we cannot see God directly, can we use our 5 senses at all to discern whether there's a God or infer whether there's a God? And yes, you can. There's what's called inference, the best explanation, or abduction. And in the view of abduction, we believe in abduction that you can observe features of reality. You can agree on certain features. You can agree on what needs to be explained, but you may disagree on why this feature of reality exists. So number 2, you may look at a feature of reality and says, what is the result, or why does it exist? Is it the result of nature itself or something outside nature? So both sides strive to offer the best explanation for the evidence. Let me give an example here. So you could look at certain features of reality, even though you cannot see God directly. You can look at these features of reality and talk about what is the best explanation. You make an inference, whether nature itself can explain these features of reality, or whether there is a God or designer or some sort of intelligence behind these features of reality. Of course, there's other features here. This is a very general overview, not extensive or exhaustive, but we certainly can use our senses to look at these features of reality and infer what the best explanation is. Now, when it comes to a biblical epistemology, of course, people have to find knowledge of God, and the deal is that we believe that people are dead, blinded, and bound to sin. So God must set the parameters of how he will grant knowledge of himself to humans. God grants human knowledge, or grants humans knowledge of himself through the natural world, through natural theology, and by history, what's called revealed or historical theology. If you want to get 2 books on the topic, you can get the book, The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. As far as history, you can get The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Habermas and Lacona. So this means God communicates through natural theology, which is the practice of philosophically revealing the existence and nature of God independent of revealed theology, which is scriptured. Of course, revealed theology or history is based on authoritarianism. We believe God has revealed himself through written text, and we can provide evidence why we think the Bible is a trustworthy written text over other religious texts such as the Quran or the Book of Mormon. And we also believe God chooses to reveal himself through religious experience. Now, some books on natural theology, if you want to get here. Fazer's books, The Last Superstition, or 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, or New Proofs for the Existence of God by Spitzer here. Those books deal with natural theology. And of course, we believe that communication is essential in a daily manner. We believe we wouldn't be able to survive without communication. We rely on text, phones, emails, social media. And that's why we believe God needs to communicate to us through natural and revealed theology. He must take the initiative to communicate with us to give us knowledge of who he is. And Aquinas said here, it's important that God takes the initiative to reveal himself to humanity, because he says here, if it are necessary to use strict demonstration is the only way to reach a knowledge of the things which we must know about God, very few could ever construct such a demonstration. Even those who could do it could only do it after a very long time. And so most people do not have the time to form a robust philosophical or a perfect rational demonstration of God's existence. So therefore God must break through to humanity, and that's what he does through revelation. Now this brings up a little bit about I want to mention something about the hiddenness of God argument. This has come up in religious epistemology. It seems that God seems to be hiding. He seems to be elusive. This has been written about in certain books here by Paul Moser and others. There's been a big debate about it. It's called the hiddenness of God argument. Basically, the hiddenness argument says if God is all-powerful, all-loving, he wants people to know him. He must not want to be hidden in any way. His existence should be more obvious. And in response, many have said God cares about how we handle the evidence he provides. He's not just interested in giving us spectator evidence. He's not just interested in giving us a sign so we can just say, oh yeah, there's a God. That's cool. God's very interested in relationship. He's interested in transformation rather than spectator sport. God is interested in active commitment. He wants us to come to know him. And he's interested in transformation. He's interested in our volitional issues. He's interested in our will. And so we need to remember that it's dangerous to purport exhaustive evidence without experiencing profound transformation. And this issue is inherently ethical and practical. And so God, in many cases, is more interested in our will. He's not so interested in just giving us a sign or spectator or spectacular evidence. He's interested in our personal transformation. And so many cases, God does not make himself avert because he knows that many people will not yield themselves over to him. They're not interested in transformation. And so this is an ongoing debate. Of course, proper knowledge of God in the Bible comes through humility. People that come humbly, faithfully, and lovingly, and they come in childlike faith, they will find God. We know that God is interested in our disposition. Dr. Michael Murray, who's a professor of philosophy, has said that one of the reasons God remains hidden, he says here, God stays somewhat hidden so that people can have space to either respond to God, or else God wants to respect our autonomy. Number two, God places a higher value on people having the free will to respond to him. And if he shows too much of himself, he takes away their free choice to respond to him. Of course, if God is too overt about his existence, people just feel obligated to believe in him in order to avoid being punished. And Murray thinks that's not good reasons for people to believe in God as well. Now let's talk about science a little bit. As of now, there's no agreed definition of science. There's several definitions. One is given here. It says because science is limited to explaining the natural world by means of natural processes, it cannot use supernatural causation in its explanations. Similarly, science is precluded from making statements about supernatural forces because these are outside its provenance. Science has increased our knowledge because of its insistence on the search for natural causes. So this definition here talks a little bit about the methodology of science. It doesn't so much give an exact definition of science. As I said, the definition of science is debated. Now, Sean Carroll, who's a well-known naturalist and a well-known physicist, says here, as a theoretical physicist, he says here that science is on the verge of providing a complete understanding of the universe and he says here that science is on the verge of providing a complete understanding of the universe that goes without saying, that precludes the antiquated notion of God altogether. And there are some problems with this statement. You can look up his debate with William Lane Craig as well. Sometimes we forget here when we talk about Carroll's definition here, what science is supposed to do or what he thinks science will do. Remember that science involves indirect verification because some things cannot be observed directly. Some things are inferred. For example, there are scientific theories about so-called dark matter, which you can't see directly. And so that involves indirect verification. And so sometimes people confuse direct and indirect verification. Obviously, the idea that science is the only way of knowing things of self-refuting. The statement itself cannot be tested empirically. There's no way for the five senses to verify the statement that only things can be known through the scientific method. And so let's not confuse indirect and direct verification. Remember also, we need to ask which branch of science has shown God doesn't exist. You never want to say science has shown God doesn't exist. You need to talk about sciences, different fields of science, such as science that studies the material world, such as physics, chemistry, biology, geology, or astronomy. Science that studies human beings, such as anatomy or psychology or physiology. Or science that shows how humans interact. The social sciences, such as linguistics, textual hermeneutics, anthropology, and sociology. So there's different branches of science. We don't want to say there's only one kind of science. We need to talk about sciences when we're talking about this discussion. Remember also that science deals with impersonal explanations. It deals with impersonal objects and the laws of nature. Certainly we observe and measure how some events regularly follow others. We then use our knowledge of those regularities to explain some state of affairs. We discover how previous events produced other events by means of natural laws. Science doesn't necessarily deal with the why questions or teleological issues, but there's other kind of explanations of reality when we talk about agent explanations. And in agent or personal explanations, this is where the person assesses his desires and beliefs, then chooses to act. In contrast to event causation, agent causation is a causal change that begins with the agent bringing about an event for a purpose. So, for example, if you say the universe has a purpose, it is there for us to exist. The universe is set up a certain way for humans to exist and we say, well, why is it set up that way? We might say a personal agent is the best explanation for that, whereas we would say an impersonal law of nature cannot account for it, because we see the foreknowledge ahead of time. We see that the universe is set up for us. Someone or some sort of agent had to think ahead of time and plan ahead to bring about the universe into existence for us to exist. And then also in this debate, we see the confusion between metaphysical naturalism and methodological naturalism. And metaphysical naturalism or methodological naturalism says that science should only seek out natural explanation and attempt to find supernatural explanations are not science, of course. In contrast, metaphysical naturalism is more philosophical, and that starts with the presupposition that all that exists is the natural or physical world. And of course, when you presuppose that all that exists is the natural physical world, and then you use methodological naturalism to prove your point, you've already rigged the rules ahead of time. That is a circular argument, because when you presuppose there are only non-natural explanations to reality, and then you only look for non-natural explanations, that is a circular argument. So in many cases, there is a confusion between these two, between metaphysical naturalism, methodological naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism is metaphysics, is a philosophical issue. And so the debate about science is really a debate about philosophy. You can't do philosophy without science. Or I should say you can't do science without philosophy. I'm sorry, correct myself. And so we see here a quote by Paul Davies. He's an agnostic that teaches physics at the University of Arizona. He wrote a piece in the New York Times. You can read it. It's called Taking Science on Faith. He said, all science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational, intelligible way. Davies says that scientists take the orderly laws of physics on faith, and he says those laws are expressed as tidy mathematical relationships. He then asks questions he's not supposed to ask. He says, where do these laws come from? And why do they have the form that they do? And what we see here is that after he wrote this article, he got a lot of pushback in his email from skeptics saying that that is just the wrong thing to ask, and they got upset with him. Just goes to show you, when you begin to bring up the issues of where the laws of nature come from, you ask these questions, you can get in trouble. And so it comes down to the issue of definition. If we're going to use definition 1, God would not be allowed, because definition 1 here says science pursues materialistic explanations for natural phenomena through empirical observation, rational theorizing. This definition excludes any non-natural explanations as unscientific in principle. It excludes intelligence as having causal primacy in any natural system. But then if we jump to number 2 here, intelligent causation would be allowed into the picture. It says here, science pursues the best explanation for natural phenomena through empirical observation, rational theorizing. Under this definition, the best explanation for some natural event or process may include intelligent causation. So the debater of the definition of science is not a matter of philosophy of religion or science proper that falls in the domain of philosophy of science. So this debate over whether science can give us knowledge of God is really a debate about philosophy of science. So make sure you read up on philosophy of science if you want to learn more about this topic. And we wrap up here with the 3 models between theology and science. Of course, we have the conflict model, which is seen in Richard Dawkins' writings and other pop atheist writings, that faith is rooted in fantasy, whereas science is based on observable, empirically available data. Faith is highly emotional and subjective, whereas science is dispassionate, impersonal, and objective. And then we have the contrast model, where science and faith are distinct, but no conflict can exist between faith and science. They each respond to radically different questions. There's no real competition between them, so there can be no conflict. And then we have the convergence model, number 3, which says science and faith are distinct because they ask different kinds of questions, but they may still interact fruitfully. The convergence model tries to move beyond both conflict and allow for an ongoing conversation between science and faith. Obviously, I would be more favorable for number 2 or 3 here, mostly number 3. So Many Christians disagree about which model to use here, and of course many atheists disagree, and that's an ongoing discussion in our culture and in academia. Let me go ahead and wrap up here with confirmation bias. I have noticed that many people think that religious people are only guilty of confirmation bias. If you've never heard of confirmation bias, this is something where we see that people tend to only process information and look for information or answers or knowledge that confirms what they already believe or is consistent with their existing beliefs. And so this is why it's called confirmation bias. People only go out and confirm what they want to already believe or what they want to believe. And of course, sometimes it's unintentional and it can ignore inconsistent information, but the point is that sometimes religious people are seen as the only ones who are guilty of confirmation bias. This is not the case at all. In my experience, skeptics and atheists do the same thing. Scientists do it. No one is 100% objective in their gathering of knowledge. So we need to try to bring some objectivity into our seeking of knowledge. That's a good thing. But everybody's guilty of some confirmation bias. So let's not try to accuse one group of being guilty of it while the other is not guilty of it. Everybody has some, they are guilty of some confirmation bias, okay? So having said that, that wraps it up with an intro to religious epistemology. I hope this helped you in your discussion, will help you in your discussion with others. Have a good day.